McDonald's once again reporting earnings where the company has to admit that its customers can't afford to buy its cheap hamburgers, no matter how good the fries are. Everyone is beginning to realize that the crappy economy of the past few years, it's not going to be so easy to shake free from. Consumer confidence is dropping. Consumer spending plans, according to the Federal Reserve, down sharply. Worries over incomes and jobs are back to dominating. There continues to be this massive disconnect between regular people, the media, driven largely by policymakers like Jay Powell, who today visited Capitol Hill to tell Congress absolutely nothing, other than how happy he is with the job the Federal Reserve has done with basically everything. Meanwhile, over here in reality, McDonald's didn't just disappoint with its latest quarterly results. Those contained the worst drop in comparable sales for the company since the lockdowns. Dollar Tree, another one, continues to see, quote, evidence of belt tightening, particularly among lower income customers and, to a lesser extent, among middle and higher income families with younger children. Consumers continue to struggle mightily. So it shouldn't be a surprise that the Federal Reserve's New York branch found that consumers are finally scaling back their overall spending plans. And this is not only lower income Americans struggling to buy a Big Mac, it's worries about costs being compounded by stronger concerns there are no jobs anywhere. And that's backed up by data from all over the economy. With hiring in a deep freeze, nominal income growth has slowed right into the danger zone, especially when you factor for government transfers. In other words, private economy income is slacking right now when it needs to be accelerating. Or exactly what Ronald McDonald just reported. After a burst of optimism to end last year, Fed rate cuts, presidential elections, here we are with all the same stories all over again. And the reason is because nothing actually changed in between. Despite that burst of optimism, it's becoming clearer that we can't just break free from the crappy economy of the past few years. There's a lot more that has to go into it. Fed rate cuts, despite what Jay Powell will say, has nothing to do with it. Instead, listen to what Ronald McDonald is saying. What the company reported for its earnings was, according to CNBC, McDonald's U.S. business reported a steeper than expected drop in its same-store sales. Same-store sales at the company's domestic restaurants here in the U.S. fell 1.4% in the quarter. Wall Street was projecting same-store sales to decline 0.6%. Now, McDonald's said traffic was slightly positive, but customers spent less than usual during the quarter. Over the summer, the chain rolled out a $5 combo meal to bring back price-conscious diners and reverse what had been sluggish sales. And that strategy worked, helping McDonald's U.S. same-store sales tick up in the third quarter. But it didn't last here in the fourth quarter, the latest quarter that they're reporting on. Now, while there was an E. coli outbreak that really did hammer results a little bit, what we're seeing is that, okay, they cut prices, and initially it led to some customers coming back into the stores, but they didn't spend nearly as much, and then almost as quickly as they came back in, they left again. And it's not just McDonald's. We see the same pattern all over the retail landscape. And according to McDonald's, it doesn't appear to be getting a whole lot better here in the first quarter. While they're optimistic for the rest of the year, what they said about the latest quarter was, looking to 2025, the first quarter is expected to be the low point for McDonald's same-store sales, at least according to CFO Ian Borden, citing a weak start to the year in the U.S., among other factors. An unexpected weak start to the year, of course, because there was no real renaissance last year. Well, everyone thought the economy bottomed out in the summertime, July, August, and September. Then the Federal Reserve banished all that weakness with its aggressive rate-cutting campaign. The truth is nothing really changed other than a short-run burst of optimism. We see in a bunch of consumer sentiment numbers, business sentiment numbers that began rolling over as early as November and really December and January. So we see consumer confidence already going back down because consumers realize nothing much had changed from the summertime. And this, of course, is an international phenomenon, not just in the United States. And McDonald's sales were saved to an extent by some, I wouldn't call it strength, but there's not quite the same level of weakness in stores outside, in restaurants outside the U.S. McDonald's International Operated Markets Division, which includes some of its biggest markets, reported same-store sales growth of 0.1%. The company said most markets reported same-store sales increases, but the UK and some other markets saw same-store sales shrink in the quarter, which is information that isn't helpful because all it really says is there's lots of weakness all around the rest of the world. Some are better than others, which we know to begin with. So McDonald's is saying exactly what we've been saying all along, that customers can't afford to eat in their stores because everyone was impoverished by 2021, 2022. The price changes. We're living in the shadow of the price illusion, the economy that forgot how to grow, and it is leaving behind way, way too many people. It's not just lower income consumers that are being pressured by lack of jobs, lack of hiring, lack of income growth, and lost purchasing power. You see it all over the spectrum. But that's where it's the most acute, and that's where it's showing up the most visibly. Another example, Dollar Tree, the dollar stores in general, Dollar General. According to a recent report, discount store closures rose almost 360% to 1,754 last year, according to data compiled by CoreSite, making the category the biggest source of shuttered shops in the period. Nashville-based Bargain Hunt is the latest discounter to succumb to financial strain, with plans to shutter more than 90 of its locations as part of last week's Chapter 11 filing. Meanwhile, Dollar Tree is seeking a strategic review for Family Dollar after closing hundreds of those stores last year. Options include a potential sales spinoff or other disposition of the business, according to public disclosures. And here's the thing, here's the kicker, they always throw this in here. While the economy remains strong overall, lower income consumers have been hit by inflation while retailers deal with high interest rates, inflation pressures, and the increasing threat from e-commerce. And the increasing threat from e-commerce is the only real part of that statement, because consumers who can't afford everything are seeking out cheaper alternatives to McDonald's and dollar stores. That's how desperate they are. And if you think this is just lower income consumers, all of the data shows otherwise. Again, that's where it's most visible. That's where we can see it. That's where it's most acute. But it isn't a strong economy, because a strong economy would mean the rising tide lifts all boats, or more than enough boats that we don't see these types of results. In fact, this is just a reflection of what we're actually seeing from labor market data. And this idea of a strong economy comes from Jay Powell and his testimony on Capitol Hill, or the financial media that just parrots what Jay Powell tells them. Powell has a vested interest to report on his own work in the most charitable fashion. And economists and policymakers and politicians, those who haven't been yet thrown out of office, have done exactly the same thing, because they don't want to tell you the economy's crappy. That reflects badly upon everything that they've been doing. But on top of McDonald's and dollar stores, how about Target? Talked about Target back in November in the thick of the Christmas season, when they reported less than stellar earnings, which sent their shares absolutely plunging. What was reported back in November was third quarter comparable sales that increased just 0.3%, which, according to the Target press release, was driven by strong traffic and digital performance. Guest traffic grew 2.4% over the prior year, but as more people showed up in the stores, each person spent less. Otherwise, you'd have a much bigger comparable store sales growth number. And remember, third quarter 2024, where this number comes from, the 0.3%, was compared to the third quarter of 2023, when comparable sales were down nearly 5%. So they're down nearly 5% in the third quarter of 23, and we're basically flat to that in the third quarter of 24, despite strong traffic that was created by all of the changes that Target had previously made throughout the summer into the fall. One of the big disappointments with Target is obviously they have a different customer base than McDonald's and the dollar stores, but they had forecast an increase and actually raised their forecast in the summertime, expecting a whole bunch of things to go right that didn't actually go right. As CNBC wrote back in November, Chief Operating Officer Michael Fidelki said, "It's disappointing that a deceleration in discretionary demand combined with some cost pressures have caused us to take our guidance back down after raising it last quarter." But he added that Target feels confident in its long-term outlook. And then they finally added that Target now expects fourth quarter comparable sales to be approximately flat. And just last month, Target updated with their Christmas results, and they were happy to announce that sales were not flat. In fact, they actually posted comparable sales growth during the fourth quarter, growth at a level of 1.5%. That's fourth quarter comparable sales, according to the company in its January update. And those compared to minus 4.4% in the fourth quarter of 2023. There isn't really much difference or any meaningful difference between plus 1.5 or flat compared to minus 4.4% the year before. What Target is saying is the same thing that McDonald's is, but for a different customer segment, different consumer segment. It's not just lower income Americans that are struggling, it's all Americans, which is why Walmart is doing so well. And while e-commerce, especially the cheap platforms, are doing gangbusters, people still can't afford to spend in the way that they would like to spend, the way that they spent for a little while a couple years ago. That was all an illusion and it wasn't sustained. And with the job market getting increasingly dicey, the path forward is it's worse than just uncertain. You could say that uncertainty and worse is exactly what dominated the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's survey of consumer expectations for the month of January. They found, first of all, contrary to the University of Michigan survey for consumers, that price expectations remain remarkably stable, both at the short run and intermediate terms. According to their results, the median for the one-year change was right at 3% for basically the last year plus. It's been at the same level. In fact, it's exactly 3% in January, just like it was in December. And it was 3% back in August and September. And the 2 months in between were 2.97% and 2.87%. So according to the Federal Reserve survey of consumers, they don't see any uptick in consumer prices, even including fears over tariffs and what those might do. The medium-term 3-year expectation, the median there was, again, back at 3% as well, after a dip toward the end of last summer into the fall. But here's the thing. One thing that appears to be changing, and at least according to the latest data in January, consumer spending expectations have fallen sharply over the last couple months, December and especially January. The median spending expectation 1 year ahead fell to 4.39%, which is a new low for the entire cycle. And while that's still above where expectations had been pre-pandemic, you can see it's the direction, and more so than just the direction, but the fact that something now appears to be changing, that finally lost purchasing power as well as fears over jobs and incomes are finally catching up to the consumer economy. You throw in their exhausted savings and then tightening credit pressures, and it gets to the point where eventually consumers would have to buckle. Now, whether this is just one monthly data point and whether or not this proves to be that point remains to be seen, but it is consistent with everything that we're seeing here, from McDonald's to dollar stores to Target and a whole bunch more beside, to the labor market data, JOLTS, hiring, quits, even the establishment survey being 5+ million behind its trend. All of these things point to eventually consumers hanging on as much as they possibly can, just can't hang on any longer. One of the things that really stood out in the consumer report from the FRBNY were both job finding fears as well as job losing fears. In terms of job finding fears, they asked the question of, if you lose your job today, how confident are you that you'll find a replacement job in a couple months? And they work out the probability, and for January 2025, it was 51.54%. And while that's more than a percentage point above December, 51.54% is, as I've been pointing out with these surveys, really since last summer, that's closer to the pandemic lockdown lows, far closer to the pandemic and lockdown lows than the pre-crisis, pre-pandemic age, when the labor market back in 2019, 2018 was hardly robust. So job finding fears are matching exactly what we're seeing in JOLTS data, as well as all the rest of the labor market when you look at it in proper context. At the same time, fears over losing their job actually spiked up in January after being low, at least in more recent times. Fears over losing jobs spiked up to 14.1% in January after being down around a recent low of 11.9% back in December. And the 14.1% in January is not far off the high which was set in April of last year. So you have an uptick in people who say they're afraid of losing their job. At the same time, a whole bunch of people say that they can't find one, and they're afraid that if they do lose their job or lose their hours, they won't be able to find a replacement too. Fears over the labor market continue to dominate consumer sentiment, which is turning in the wrong direction. We see that in other surveys as well, like the University of Michigan survey for the month of February. That index fell unexpectedly from a high that was set in December. And according to Bloomberg, sentiment among Republicans declined for the first time since August. And it continued to deteriorate for Democrats, the lowest since 2020. Confidence also dropped among political independents, and they added, moreover, it is taking more time for unemployed Americans to find a job. That's backed up by the data as well as consumer sentiment surveys. Fears over the job market seemed to go away at the end of last year, but the job market itself didn't actually change, regardless of what the payroll report may have said and the revisions to it may have said for November and December. So while there was some optimism over a couple factors, including, some people, they believe in the Fed's rate cuts because, that's what everything is set up to tell you to believe in. So the Fed start cutting rates and optimism spikes up, but the real economy doesn't actually change. And that's what we're seeing all the evidence of. Nothing really changed over the couple months where sentiment got optimistic for the first time in a while. One final point here, incomes. When you look at private sources of income in nominal terms, nominal income excluding transfer payments rose only 1.93% for the final 6 months of last year. 1.93% is, in nominal terms, below that 2% danger zone line, which suggests that everything that Ronald McDonald reported, or the dollar stores, or Target, or FRBNY in its consumer surveys, that's what it's coming from, lack of income. And even though transfer payments have been accelerating from the government over more recent months, that's mostly in Medicare transfers, which aren't exactly spendable. Well, that may be great for the healthcare industry, for hospitals and doctors. It's not great for the overall economy. So in one sense, incomes look better than they actually are when we talk about just the private economy, simply because there's lots of transfer payments and an increase in transfer payments, but it's not spendable funds. So it goes back to everything that we heard from McDonald's and the data that we're getting from the labor market, or data we're getting on consumer confidence and evidence from markets and everything else. It all says the economy is really struggling. And that did not change at the end of 2024. You cannot impoverish the entire country, the entire world, and expect the economy to just glide gently into the soft landing that Jay Powell, as I'm speaking right now, is up on Congress testifying that he actually accomplished. It doesn't work that way. So consumers, McDonald's, what they say is their customers, which tend to be lower income, the customers can't afford to spend in their stores. Dollar Tree can't afford to compete with online platforms that have been set up specifically to take advantage of customers and consumers who can't afford to shop in the way that they need to, or they used to, that they want to. And the reason they can't is because they lost a massive amount of purchasing power. And the labor market, contrary to all popular and mainstream assessments, is not even close to making up the difference. And more it appears, and Americans know this, that it's not going to. This weakness globally is most visible right now in Mexico. Mexico reported some sobering statistics in addition to the fact that its central bank is also accelerating its rate cutting schedule. Went over all of those details in the video link below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and subscribers. And until next time, take care.